Welcome to the Likeville podcast. This is John Faithfulhamer. Today I'm going to be interviewing Jaffer Ali, serial entrepreneur, teaches media studies on the side and all-around marketing genius. Very interesting guy. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about why we're doing the Likeville podcast, because Jaffer Ali is actually part of the reason why we decided to do this. Jaffer Ali has been a critic of the way media discourse has been happening in the United States in general, but also in North America, more broadly. And what we see is increasingly people are speaking in sound bites. They're arguing, talking past each other, right? They're engaging in gotcha journalism, where you interview somebody for an hour and a half and then take some things that they say out of context to make them look stupid or to bolster some point that you're trying to make. I mean, we see this all the time, even in little ways. If they're trying to make a particular point about Montrealers here in the city where I live, they will stand outside of a metro and they'll interview a whole bunch of people, sometimes 100 people, right? But then if you watch the nightly news, they'll show 4 or 5 people who said what they wanted somebody to say. So it's not that those people are actors. They're not. They're actual real citizens. But what you're not seeing is the huge selection process that's happening. So our idea with the Likeville podcast was to have a long form, totally unscripted conversation between two people who are trying to be as charitable as possible, who are trying to understand each other and having a friendly, intelligent conversation. So if you think that's important to have that sort of thing out there to try and elevate the discourse at the moment, which is pretty bad, then you should support the podcast right now. The most obvious way that you can support us is to go to www.patreon.com/Likeville podcast and become a Patreon supporter of the podcast. That is the best way to do it. Also, you should go to Facebook if you're on Facebook and enter Likeville into a Facebook group and become a member of our Facebook group, because we very often put out important information about upcoming podcasts, opportunities to ask guests questions in advance, which has worked very well in the past. Also, our Likeville Twitter handle is at the Likeville Pod. We had to shorten it because of the character limits. If you follow us on Twitter, that's also an excellent way to stay up to date with what we're doing. As you know, our main streaming location for the moment is on iTunes. However, if you aren't a big fan of Apple, I know many of you have a problem with Apple, you can listen to the podcast on overcast.fm. You can just go to overcast.fm and then type in Likeville, and it will all pop up, and there we are. This podcast is also brought to you by Good Mix, which is a delicious sort of granola seed paleo mix that you put inside your yogurt and you have it for breakfast. It's absolutely delicious, really, really healthy, very good for you, fills you up for hours and hours and hours. It has great effects on your digestion, all sorts of things. Really, really great stuff. And there's some links to Good Mix. This podcast is also brought to you by Seb Furtado Photography. Sebastian Furtado is a professional fine art photographer who is offering private online one-on-one classes for those who want to drastically improve their skills in photography. It's available to participants worldwide. Sebastian Furtado is an experienced teacher and workshop organizer. He'll teach you how your camera works, the camera basics, lighting, lenses, and how to shoot images and perfect them in Lightroom and Photoshop. If you're interested in this, go to www.sebfurtado.com/store for more information. So today we will be talking to Jaffer Ali. He has a very unique position on marketing and on the media because he's been one of the wizards behind the scenes he's behind the sort of the river dance phenomenon. He was the person, his company was that put that on everybody's list, the river dance, Lord of the Dance, Stomp. He also, I found out, I was quite surprised to find out that the whole Faces of Death series, which me and my friends in the late 80s and early 90s watched feverishly. It was unbelievable. We were all crazy about this. And these tapes would be passed around in hushed tones. And, well, it turns out, well, I'm not going to give it away, but Jaffer was behind the Faces of Death series as well. And that's kind of an amazing story. But all right, without further ado, I give you my conversation with Jaffer Ali. Good morning, Jaffer.
Good morning, John. How are you?
I'm very well. So why don't you, I mean, there's some specific things that I wanted to talk to you about, but maybe you could sort of tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, you're a successful entrepreneur. You teach media studies. You do all sorts of things, right?
Right. Well, I've been an entrepreneur since I graduated from the University of Illinois. I've been successful and failed several times.
Yeah, you were bankrupt at 25 with a restaurant, right?
That's correct. I learned that that's a tough business to
Oh
make
yeah,
go.
oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it's funny. Something I just interviewed Nassim the other day, and he said that they have these ratings in lots. I mean, they have this here in Montreal as well. They have ratings for sort of best falafel, best burger in the city, best, whatever, right? And he said very often if you call those places, they're out of business.
Well,
by the time they award the awards, they're out of business. It's I mean, it's amazing.
Well, it was in Phoenix, Arizona. I was going to graduate school and running a Middle Eastern restaurant. And then it was 1979, and something happened in Iran. They took the American hostages, and people didn't know the difference between Iranian and Arab, and we had belly dancers and Lebanese singers, and our business just went into the toilet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, after 9/11, when I was living in Baltimore, they were beating up Sikhs.
Sure.
From South Asia. It's like, if you're going to be racist, at least be smart about it, get them right,
Well, most racists aren't real bright anyway.
Yeah. But I mean, that was just crazy. I mean, they had no idea, how to tell anybody apart. But so the first thing I want to ask you about is because, I mean, this is something, a friendly disagreement we've had for years now, is your sort of problem with the mainstream media.
Correct.
Right? So maybe you could just sort of tell me, why do you think that the mainstream media is ultimately more dangerous than someone like Alex Jones or and InfoWars?
The mainstream media is more dangerous precisely because more people believe them. I mean, Alex Jones is some fringe nut, and he's easily discredited. But when you have a lot of people who...
But a lot of people don't think he's bullshit.
Well,
I mean, people in my family think he's good. He's right on.
Well, you know what? It's still a much smaller percentage than MSNBC and ABC and CBS. So let's take a look, and let's go back to World War One, okay, where Woodrow Wilson was the president, and he hired 75,000 4-Minutemen to go out to spread lies to get us into the war. Mm-hmm. And then he hired Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann. These are, bastions of liberal democracy, and it was a propaganda campaign to mobilize the United States to go to war. And we did go to war, and we had over 300,000 people die. To my knowledge, Alex Jones has not been responsible for hundreds of thousands of people dying. George Bush Jr., how many he there was over 1 million people killed on his lies that were promoted by the mainstream media. We
Mm-hmm.
can go back if you read Ulysses Grant's memoirs. Who he wrote his own memoirs, by the way.
I've read them. They're
Okay,
fantastic. Yeah.
they're fantastic,
Yeah.
and he is quite candid about the propaganda and the lies for the Mexican American War,
Yeah.
because he was he fought in that. So and all of the media. Now I've lived in the Middle East, and everybody in the Middle East knows that the media is completely controlled, just like they did in Soviet Union. Knew it was completely controlled. I mean, Stalin once told Lenin's widow that she better toe the line or he would create a new widow.
See,
Okay.
and that's funny. I heard the story differently. I heard
Okay.
that Lenin on his deathbed said one of his like final comments. I mean, there's so much bullshit around them. It's hard to know what's true, but that he said on his deathbed, "Do not let Stalin become the leader. He's a complete butcher. He's a monster." And so Lenin's wife was going to actually spread this knowledge, and Stalin said, "Well, he's had an affair on you for forever, and I will like spread this news, and it will totally humiliate you and embarrass you if you spread this news." So it was like, if you show, you tell your piece of information, I'll tell mine. And so she didn't say anything, and we got the terror, but.
Well, I mean, either way, it is the media that propagates the myths of the power elite, of the oligarchs. And it doesn't matter if you're in a totalitarian regime or a liberal democracy. And so the bottom up cacophony and chaos of social media, okay, is very unstructured. But the mainstream media, they have an amazing unity, and they do, as Chomsky says, prescribe the limits and the barriers from which the discussions can take place. And quite often, they lie, whether it be Judith Miller from the New York Times lying about weapons of mass destruction. And, she never outed any of her sources in the Pentagon who
Mhm.
lied to her, and she could have, so that they could have protected future journalists from this disinformation.
Yeah, it's
But
funny.
and
I just wanted to return to something you said about World War One, because it occurs to me that one of the sort of dangerous side effects of that propaganda campaign is that they said that the Germans were doing all sorts of horrible atrocities
yeah,
to get people into the war. And this is, a lot of people don't realize this, but one of the main reasons why a lot of Americans and Canadians as well, but especially Americans, didn't believe the stories of the concentration camps that were filtering over the Atlantic was because they thought, people usually say, oh, it's because of anti-Semitism that they didn't believe it. But actually, and I'm sure that played some factor, but the main reason was they said, oh, look, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice. They're like, clearly you're just trying to get us into the war again. You're trying to get us into a war with Germany yet again. We're not going to fall for it this time, right? And there was a big congressional inquiry. I mean, you probably know on this. You probably teach on this. But there was a big congressional inquiry in the 1930s into the propaganda campaign that brought the United States into World War One. It's a fascinating report, and it contains all the information you mentioned before about how much money went into this, and the top minds and public relations people that they brought into it. And so the report had just come out in the mid 30s. So this was fresh public knowledge. So when they
right.
heard about the concentration camps, they thought, "Oh, right, you're lying again, right?"
Right. But those, I mean, one of the lies that were told were that the Germans were bayoneting babies,
Yeah.
and that resurfaced in the first Iraqi Gulf War, where they said that the Iraqis were throwing babies out of incubators, and they hired Knowlton and Hilton, a big PR firm out of Missouri, out of St. Louis, and the Kuwaitis spent hundreds of millions of dollars to make the PR and to demonize the Iraqis. Now, I have never been a fan of Saddam Hussein, but my overall point was that before there was a term called fake news, there was always fake news. Upton Sinclair wrote The Brass Check. The Brass Check was a takeoff of in the houses of ill repute. You would get a brass check and you'd give it to the prostitute, and that said that you were cleared by the madam. And his whole premise was that the whole media were prostitutes. Now they call them prostitutes. Okay, okay. But so I have a real problem with journalists, and I have to say that just one more reason why I've always loved Nassim Taleb's writings is that he really goes after a lot of the journalists.
Yes, he does. Well, somebody said to me, I thought, I was like, wow, I definitely have to mention this to Jaffer. So one of the listeners of the Likeville podcast who listened to the interview with Nassim, he wrote this really, really nasty comment on, I think it was on Twitter or Facebook. And he said, there was in Washington, D.C., somebody went into a newsroom and shot people.
Oh, yes. In Virginia, I believe it was.
Was it Virginia? Okay.
Yeah.
And basically said that the blood of those dead journalists was on Taleb's hands because he's part of these people who are constantly sort of hating on journalists, and now you get responses. So it's like when Cernovich spread that whole bullshit story about Pizzagate, and then the guy shows up with a gun. Yeah, like at a certain point, ideas have consequences, right? And if you keep yelling fire all the time in a crowded theater, right? Like you have a response. There's actually, I don't know if have you got into that show Homeland at all?
No, you know what? I have never watched any episodes of it.
Oh, really? Well, there's one really interesting subplot in the show is there's a character who's very, very clearly modeled on Alex Jones, right? And he's basically this, he's exactly like Alex Jones. But you find out that, in fact, in his personal life, he's a total fraud. Like he's a big gun nut on his show, but he's actually never fired a gun in his life. And he's just like a total fraud. But what happens is all of these like hundreds of thousands of Americans become like obsessed with this guy, and they tattoo his face onto their arms, and these militia groups, and they actually have an armed uprising, and all these people die. And there's this amazing scene where the Alex Jones character has this realization that, holy shit, like I actually fired all these people up, and they listened to me. I was just trying to be entertaining. I was just, I didn't think this would have any consequences. It's amazing.
Yeah, I hear you. It's just that I just think that mainstream media all over the world has an imperative. In liberal democracies, it's to make money and to spread the narratives and the myths of the prevailing power structure.
Yeah, but I mean, the mainstream media in the United States, if you go by size and market share, is Fox. But yet, if you go on Fox, they still act like they're the underdog, which is something that, my mother always told me, don't be a sore loser, don't be a sore winner. There's nothing worse than a winner who keeps acting like they're the underdog.
Yeah. Well, and Fox is part of the mainstream media. They are playing like they're not, but they're spreading the myth and narrative of Trumpism.
Mm-hmm. No, because I notice usually when people talk about mainstream media, they will mention CNN, MSNBC, ABC, but they leave Fox off the list. And in fact, you'll see people on like Sean Hannity, people who have like a massive market share, and they're calling themselves, the underdogs.
Yeah,
It's like, what are you doing?
I'll always include Fox in my diatribes against mainstream media. I just don't watch them anymore.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what do you think? I mean, this is, it's like, I think it was Churchill who said, democracy is a terrible form of government, but it's better than all the others, or something like that. I mean, what exactly do you think is a replacement for the mainstream media?
Well, I think that we're in a transition. Okay, we're in a transition from a top-down media structure to a bottom-up. And the bottom up is a cacophony, it's chaos, and we all have to develop filters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the mainstream media exists as a curator and a filter, and they're filtering really, the power elite, and the oligarchs, and there's no, in my opinion, it's just not much of a dispute that that's what is happening, and the the voices from the bottom up are, it's a lot of noise and it's a lot of chaos. And so I think that what we have to do is, we're developing our own filters. We all have a worldview, and it's becoming much more idiosyncratic than having it be pushed on us from the top.
Yeah, but there are ways to game a bottom up system as well. I mean, I don't like that's the whole thing that they talk about with like meddling in the election and everything like that. It's possible to game a bottom up system as well.
You know what? Absolutely. I mean, if we take economics as an example, I mean, it is possible for a pet rock, a freaking rock, to become a hit. Okay. Now I don't know. The hula hoop is over 3,000 years old. Did you know that?
No, I didn't.
But in 1954, something happened from the bottom up, and over 35 million hula hoops were sold in 9 months. Yeah, it is possible to gain, to get a mass adoption of a meme, of an idea. It's much more difficult to do from the bottom up than from the top down.
Yeah. No, that's very true. That's I have a former student who's doing a marketing degree right now, and she was telling me how she has a really fantastic teacher who worked in marketing for decades and then retired and teaches on the side, kind of like you do, just as a public service,
Yes.
And he was saying, the problem with marketing programs, and this applies to a lot of things that are entrepreneurial, is that even if we give you good advice, the fact that we're giving the same advice to so many people means that this advice is probably useless.
Yeah, sure. Sure, but I mean, John, because I'm a businessman and, a media critic, what you say about gaming a system is kind of like creating a hit product. Okay? 20 years ago, if you take let's call it a flap, a non-linear success. 20 years ago, we were the marketers of one of the biggest videos of the year. Actually, it was the largest video of the year. It was called Riverdance. It was Irish,
yeah.
Right?
I saw that.
And we were the marketers of it on TV, and it was incremental. Then all of a sudden it took off and became a wild success, and we tried to recreate it. And by the way, we went broke trying to recreate it. I mean, I could have retired, after that success, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, we said no. We thought we were geniuses when we didn't know what or how, but in essence, a hit product is like, gaming the system. They're so rare. But back in the day, in the 1950s and 1960s, when you had, you could go in the 1960s and have one commercial on the Beverly Hillbillies and reach 60 million people in 30 seconds. Now you have to really spend a tremendous amount of money and energy to reach 60 million people. But it happens.
Yeah. And you've got to be lucky.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know what? No, nobody can. It's kind of like, uh, John. If it was so easy, the Likeville podcast would garner millions of listeners. Within a month and a half.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I remember you told me that once. I was asking you about marketing or something like that. And you said, well, basically you do your best and then you just hope. Right, you
Right.
just hope it works out because there's not really if there was a reliable way to do it, then everybody would be doing it.
There's no formula,
Yeah.
okay? But our approach now to marketing is, if I'm going to use Talib speak, is we're going to clip the left tail. In other words, we're going to, eliminate the risk of ruin,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, and then let the chips fall where they may, and we keep our hook in the water. And
Yeah.
I think that that's the same thing with memes or selling products or selling a political agenda. Yeah. I'm less worried about willful gaming, because I've been trying to, quote, game the system by selling something, and knowing that it's really enormously difficult, much more difficult today to impose your political will or to sell a product than it was 30 years ago.
Yeah. This is interesting. So I'm seeing a real parallel between what you're saying about marketing and what a lot of the best generals have said, including Grant, by the way, if you remember in his memoirs, a lot of the best generals say in their memoirs, they say, look, I can tell you how we won step by step and all the good decisions we made and things like that. But that would give you a false sense of certainty, because in fact, there's a number of situations where I made a mistake. I went left when our plans were to go right, and it turned out that left was the right way to go.
Yeah.
And so you can look back, even if they prove, for instance, that as I believe they did, that the Russians meddled in the last election in a very big way. They must have tapped into existing fissures and divisions. Because they were setting up like Facebook pages for Black Lives Matter and saying really crazy things, and then setting up Blue Lives Matter pages and saying really crazy. They couldn't have done that if there were not these existing tensions and hatreds already in American society.
Yeah. I mean, I believe that the passions were exploited.
Yeah.
It was they were selling something, and it just happened to click. But I mean, it's not an easy thing to accomplish, and I'm less afraid of it because I know how difficult it is.
Yeah.
All
But
right?
there is interesting. Yeah, Stephen Marsh, the journalist who's actually been on the podcast a couple of times, and he's written on this a great deal. And the question he tries to understand, and I wanted to ask you about this too, is he says, why does the United States seem to be uniquely susceptible to this kind of manipulation? And he gives a couple of counter examples. He says, the Russians paid like trolls and stuff like that, tried to meddle in the German election. It completely failed, and he tells the whole story of that. They tried to meddle in the French election. They sent sort of all this opposition research, really dirt on both sides, to each other, and both of them were like, "Fuck you, we're not using this," and it just fell flat. And then in Canada as well, they leaked some sort of potentially embarrassing stuff about one of our main ministers here, and leaked it to the opposite party, and the Conservative Party of Canada said, we're not using this. And they refused. And he said, why is it that immediately in these other countries, when they try and manipulate like this, the party sees right through it, and they choose country over party.
Right. Well, you know what? In the United States, Gore Vidal called us. He said the USA stood for the United States of Amnesia. And if you destroy somebody's sense of history and memory, if you will, it's hard to learn. Okay. All right. So maybe in the 1930s, when the report on the World War I propaganda just came out, Okay, it was too soon in World War. The concentration camps. They couldn't forget that we were lied into war.
Yeah.
Okay, it was too soon. But by 1991, we had completely forgot about that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when I teach, for example, um, I teach the history of an idea, not just the idea, to try
Mm-hmm.
to give them historical context. And Neil Postman, who's
Oh,
who
he's fantastic.
I prefer him to McLuhan.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, even though McLuhan is a wonderful dialectician, but Neil Postman said that every topic that you teach, whether it be engineering, math, you should teach the history of what you're teaching
Mm-hmm.
to learn a historical context. So in the United States, we don't even have historical context. And so we're more susceptible. We are very if you rip ideas away from the history and the context, you become much more susceptible to manipulation.
Yeah, that
It's a
makes a lot
very,
of
very,
sense.
and so Canadians, okay, you have a much better sense of history, of Canadian history,
Yeah.
okay, than Americans have of American history.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always of two minds with that. I mean, because I was trained to a large extent as a historian, but I'm always kind of two minds on whether. Yeah, I think Nietzsche was onto something when he said that in that famous essay of his on the uses and disadvantages of history for life, where he says history can be really important in terms of for exactly the reasons you were saying, to have a memory, to give you a context and all that stuff. It's important for that. But he also says having history can actually make you so stuck in the past that you can't experience the present or have new possibilities for the future. So for instance, probably the ugliest example that I can think of is my really good friend of my sister's. She grew up in Sarajevo. And when I asked her once, I said, what do you think went wrong in Yugoslavia? And she said, well, basically Tito, for all of his flaws, he really promoted unity. And he said, we're all Yugoslavs and we're all in this together. And he very much suppressed people being all into like their roots and their, stuff like that. But then after he died and things started to sort of loosen up, suddenly you got these like hardcore nationalists, these ethnic nationalists who emerged. And they started, going in the front of classrooms and saying to this, to the Serb students or to the Croat or to the, whatever, saying, do you know what that kid's grandfather did to your grandmother? I can't believe you're friends with that kid. What is wrong with you? I can't believe you're dating her. Do you know what her grandfather did to your grandmother? And like, so these people who were getting along perfectly fine for a long time, there was a lot of intermarriage. Everybody was hanging together. Suddenly they were taught how to hate each other.
Yeah.
And that's history, right?
Well, yes, but it's a toxic or an extreme example of using history. And what I'm talking about is placing things in context. So my mother's 91 and a half years old, God bless her, but
That's amazing.
She's got Alzheimer's, and
Wow.
her memory is completely destroyed, and so she's in a 90-second loop.
When did that happen?
In the last 3 years, and her sisters and mother all lived to be in their late 90s, and
I'm really sorry about that, Jaffer.
Oh, thank you so much. But when you see somebody's memory destroyed, they can't learn anything new, and they're more susceptible to being manipulated. So I'm seeing that in the microcosm, and I'm saying that at scale, a nation that really doesn't have a historical context. Now, it doesn't mean that you should live in the past. It doesn't mean but what we're having is a dialectical discussion. Here's the thesis, And then the antithesis is, okay, well, what are we going to have? Live in the past and use the Yugoslavia and the hatreds of the past, and then we're going to transcend that in order to have to have a solution.
Yeah.
So I don't believe that we can rip ourselves away from our past.
Yeah.
Okay. Nor can we live in the past.
It's funny. You're making me think of there's this like really charismatic con artist in our neighborhood up here in Montreal.
Oh my! That doesn't make me feel good.
Well, he's like
Okay.
he's a really really charismatic guy. He's very smiley and good looking and stuff like that. And he basically his story is always some version of, hey, my sister just got in an accident and she's in a hospital in Toronto and I really need to take a bus to go see her now, but I lost my wallet. Can you just give me like the money to get the bus ticket? And he's so convincing. But of course, he works the same neighborhood all the time. So he either gets you or he gets somebody but then he never gets you a second time because you remember. Or if your friend tells you and passes on that useful information, he's not going to get. So the only way he's in business is because we have a regular stream of people coming into this neighborhood from elsewhere, tourists coming for the jazz festival, or new students that are coming to McGill University or to UQAM or Concordia. So he basically relies on people who don't have memory. Yeah.
Right.
So if you had if everybody in this neighborhood had like amnesia or they had Alzheimer's, he could work people again and again because they would forget. So I get your point. I get your point. Is by the way, just on the whole Alzheimer's thing, I volunteered in an old folks home for a number of years when I was younger, and there were a number of the women in the old folks home who had pretty severe Alzheimer's, and I also was very, very fascinated by watching, what that did to the personality in different people. And it's interesting because one time, for instance, there was a woman that I really liked, and I would go and talk to her and hang out with her and stuff like that, and sometimes give her dinner. And I remember once she said to me, she said, she looked kind of scared, and she said, "Who is that man standing in the doorway?" And I turned around, and there's this big burly guy, about 6'1", 6'2", barrel chested, and he's leaning up against the corner of the door, and he's looking in, and I'd never seen him before. And this big guy, when he heard her say that, he just started crying, and he turned around and he walked out. And so I went out of the room and I said, "Excuse me, sir, can I help you? What's up?" And he said, "That's my mother."
Right.
And she didn't even remember him. And he was so, this happened almost 30 years ago. And I remember it perfectly. It was that vivid and powerful. So I'm very sorry that you're going through that experience. That's terrible.
Well, thank you.
But I've also noticed another weird, and this is sort of looping back to this, another friend of mine, her mother got Alzheimer's pretty bad, and her mother had been a very angry person. She sort of held on to resentments for decades. She was you could see it in her face. She was just always angry, always pissed off. And when the Alzheimer's hit, before she was diagnosed, there was this, I think if I remember correctly, it was like a year and a half of this. She became incredibly happy. And she looked like, 10, 20 years younger. She fell in love with her husband again. And it's because she suddenly had forgotten to be angry about all these past things.
Well, you know what? I mean, my mother, and we have a caregiver, and she lives next door to me with my sister. And so I'm over there every day. She's turned into an overwhelmingly sweet old lady. And she was never sweet. And so I'm saying, well, okay.
Isn't that fascinating?
Because she's forgotten, all of her resentments of life.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing transformation.
Yeah.
I say.
Well, I remember when I was a kid, my mom used to go to this Tibetan Buddhist temple, and I used to go with her often. And the little old guy, basically like the imam, the priest, sort of.
Right.
Actually, it's much more like an imam than a priest because they don't really have any special authority. They just take care of the the meditation center, and they sort of give instruction, but they don't have any big authority. But anyway, so his name was Geshe-la, and he was the Tibetan Lama that ran the center. And this guy, he was like he radiated love. He was always smiling and giggling. He was an incredibly happy person. And it almost, he was like childlike, you know, he would giggle at the slightest thing. He was so lighthearted and filled with joy. And I asked him once, I said, like, you know, how can you be so happy? And he said, this is the resting state for a human being. It's just, we get weighed down by resentments and anger. No. And so when I see, you know, when you tell me about your mother, I think this is our birthright is to be that joyful, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
Do you think there's a way to get there through prayer or through spiritual practice without having Alzheimer's?
You know what? Yes. I happened to, about 25 years ago, go to MIU, Maharishi International University, for a 4-day meditation course.
Okay.
And through prayer and through meditation, because when the root of the word prayer in Arabic, salah, the root means connection. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's an important word. Okay, so what are we connecting? We're connecting to something, you know, greater. Now, in meditation, they say you're connecting to the field of universal knowledge. Okay, when you get to, as you descend or ascend into different forms of consciousness. But I really do believe that prayer and meditation, they've been around for thousands and thousands of years for a reason. And it does have a calming influence. For me, it does. You know, and it's experiential. I don't think you can get there through hardcore reason. I think it's experiential.
Yeah, I went on a retreat a few years ago that was organized through my church, and it was very interesting because it was our pastor who was sort of leading it, and he had us do all of these like really old early Christian prayers from Egypt in the first centuries of Christianity. And it's very fascinating because it almost feels like yoga or sort of the kind of prayers that Muslims do, you know. It's very physical, right? It's not Protestant prayer where it's just very sort of intellectual and cerebral. You do prostrations. You get down flat, and you lay down, you have prostrations, and you say certain prayers, and that it was just very physiological, and it felt like it felt much more real, sort of getting your body involved in it like that, you know. But yeah, I mean, but your spiritual practice has always been something of great interest to me. I mean, where are you in your sort of spiritual life? What gives you peace at the moment?
You know, well, I happen to have been lucky to marry an amazing woman who exudes this peace, you know, from every pore of her body, and you know, I'll be 62 next month, and I think I'm just past the struggles. Okay, I mean, you know. So I'm really enjoying, you know, the third act, or as the French say, the troisième âge.
Yeah. So this like kind of, it's generally peaceful, right? Generally right. And so, I mean, but when you look forward for your children and grandchildren, do you feel hopeful about the United States?
Well, you know, I'm always hopeful, but I believe that we're really on a terrible road. It's not just Trump. I think our problems are much deeper than Trump. I think that we're, you know, every empire that has existed has fallen, and I believe that we are experiencing a collapsing empire. and this empire was financed with debt. We have worldwide debt at unprecedented levels, and so I see a nation. I see student debt now is past $1.5 trillion.
That's
Now,
outrageous. Outrageous.
it's more than credit card debt. We have mortgage debt over $10 trillion in just the United States. We have, debt is toxic once you cross a certain level.
Mm-hmm.
And so, while I'm always hope for the best, I have to say that um, as you transition from an empire to a crumbled empire, whether it was the Soviet Empire crumbled, there was a tremendous dislocation. The British Empire it didn't have a soft landing. Okay, it was somewhat mitigated by the United States, but every empire in decline has its issues. So my three sons, I hope the best. I've tried to give them, a good foundation that they could cope with a chaotic environment. But I think that we're headed for a lot more chaos.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, with my two sons, I've tried to sort of encourage them to have certain virtues that will make them more sort of robust, will make them more
Right.
able to deal with the situation. I mean, I definitely have not told them, for instance, okay, follow this particular career path, get these
Yeah.
degrees, and then you'll have a job for life. Like I'd say, it's
Yeah.
not that way. You're actually going to have to sort of create your job. You're going to have to create your own businesses. You're going to have to be very flexible because there's a lot of bumpy roads ahead. Right? It's not gonna be pretty. Right? But
John. If I could make a suggestion,
yeah,
you may want to have Yanir Baryam on your podcast. I don't know if you know Yanir.
no,
Okay, Yanir is not a friend of Nassim's, but he runs the Complexity Institute in New England.
okay.
Joe Norman, who I think
Oh, sure, I know him. Yeah, yeah.
Joe Norman is at that Complexity Institute, and Nassim also goes there. But what we're talking about is how are we going to navigate this complex environment
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
amidst that we can't predict the future. So how can we make ourselves more robust? And I've gone to the New England Complexity Institute. It's kind of like an East Coast version of the Santa Fe Institute.
Oh, wow.
Okay,
Okay.
and by the way, he's a tremendous interview, and I think that you'd really like him. And if you'd want, I can make an
Yeah,
introduction.
no, that would be awesome.
Yeah,
Another question I wanted to make sure to ask you is you've said that when you read Nassim Nicholas Taleb's Anti-Fragile,
yeah,
that this sort of completely described your experience as an entrepreneur, as a
yes.
businessman. Can you explain why that is the case?
Well, I mean, what Nassim did was put into words, put into a narrative, you know, the entrepreneur's journey. Okay, to borrow part of
Joseph
Joseph
Campbell's,
Campbell's,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, a hero's
And,
journey.
right, as an entrepreneur, we are a fragile lot who seek to become to gain exponentially. I mean, there's something existential about entrepreneurship. You yearn for freedom. Okay, you yearn for independence. Okay, you have skin in the game. So all of Nassim's ideas really describe what an entrepreneur is all about, and so we understand fragility way before you understood what the word meant. Okay, you
Mm-hmm.
understood anti-fragility, which was a term that Nassim created. But you have exponential increases. Hey, we experienced anti-fragility with Riverdance.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't know why it had suddenly went convex until after the fact.
Yeah.
Ah, um, so all of the scale between fragility and anti-fragility with robustness. How are you going to survive? Okay, how are you going to avoid ruin? All of these terms that Nassim really articulated, we understood. Every entrepreneur that I've ever known and ever spoken to understood them, even if they didn't have the language.
Yeah. So he put that into words, right?
Correct.
Yeah, it's funny what you're saying about the river dance, because I saw it was Jon Stewart on a show. I can't remember which. I think it was Bill Maher, but he was interviewing, and he said, well, one thing I had to really sort of admire about Trump during the election campaign is, he said, the way that he puts together a stump speech is exactly the way comics put together a good act. So he goes from place to place, and he basically just tries out new material, and he's just throwing a lot of stuff on the wall to see what sticks. So rather than, he doesn't come up with his stump speech by focus groups and experts with PhDs and, doing, like, no. He goes out on the road, he tries a bunch of different stuff, and he sees what gets a lot of applause. And he doesn't really try and analyze why it worked. He just recognizes that it worked. And so then he says, okay, well, I'm going to stick with that. And this didn't get a good response, so scrap that. And he just, through tinkering, through sort of trial and error, he comes up with these really powerful speeches in the same way. And he goes, that's exactly the way Chris Rock puts together a good comedy show.
Right. Well, John, I don't know if you remember, or, this may have been before your time, but there was this video called Faces of Death.
Oh, yes. I totally remember that. That freaked me out when I was a teenager.
Well, that was our video that we released worldwide. That? Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Actually, it was produced by Disney filmmakers that changed their name because they didn't want to be associated with it. But it was available for 6 months, and it had only sold 1,500 copies. I got a call from a Reuters reporter who had gone to a Michigan video store. This is in the 80s, late 80s.
Yeah.
And the video store owner told him that it was the best renting video, that he had to replace it several times. And so he rented it, and then he had to talk to us. So he calls me up, and he said, well, what do you think of Faces of Death? I said, well, I think it's pretty disgusting. I said, it's not something that I would care to have my kids watch. And he was intrigued, so he wrote a story. And I made up something on the box. It said, banned in 46 countries. Now, this is before the internet.
I cannot believe this was you. Do you realize, this was talked about in hushed tones among my peers when I was in high school? This was your thing.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
And so we put, on the box, it was like the band in Boston kind of a phenomenon.
Sure.
And the Reuters reporter said, well, where is it banned? So I made up, I said, Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, that he couldn't verify. Okay? Now, this is in my youth when I didn't have an evolved sense of morality or something. So this story went
hilarious.
viral. The story went viral. Okay? And within 9 months, I was giving 10 interviews a day. And each time I was blasting Faces of Death. I was blasting the hypocrisy of anybody, though, that it was like the Hydra being head cut off when 4 more would come up. I was interviewed on CBS by Bob Schieffer. I was on Nightline, and then it was, and each time they're attacking me, attacking Faces of Death, attacking our company, and each time we're being attacked, it is the sales we're going to do. So from 1,500 units, okay, that went on to sell $25 million worth of video.
Oh my God.
Okay, and we came up with Faces of Death 2, Faces of Death 3. It became an institution.
Yeah.
So when this is back to your original question about anti-fragility, and you know that the example that Nassim used, and as a Hydra, his head is cut off, and 2 more, will emerge. Well, the more you attack Trump, the stronger he gets. The more that we were attacked for Faces of Death, the more the sales went up. We spent $0 in advertising.
That is
And if you know,
unbelievable. The
Trump,
news did it all for you.
oh, right. And the same thing would happen with Trump. Hillary Clinton outspent the Trump organization 20-1. They spent billions of dollars, but Trump was getting all this free publicity, and people were attacking him, and he got stronger and stronger. The path to getting rid of Trump is to ignore him. That's the worst thing that you could do to him.
Yeah. No, you see the same thing with Jordan Peterson and Nassim Nicholas Taleb. The more people trash them, the more other people go and buy their books.
Absolutely. So when I was reading Anti-Fragility, I was thinking Faces of Death.
Unbelievable. I had no idea. I knew that you were a big supporter of the civil rights documentary series. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The civil rights documentary series.
It was what was it called again? It was like the Eyes on the Prize.
Oh yeah. Well, look, there's a bit of a dialectical anomaly. I am overwhelmingly anti-war, and yet I have a rabid reader of generals: Patton, MacArthur, Grant, Lee, Eisenhower. I read all about Rommel, the generals, right?
Yeah.
And I am very much pro civil rights. The FBI's War Against Black America we produced, which was an award-winning film.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I've shown that in classes, actually. I didn't know that was yours either, by the way.
Yeah.
Crazy.
And there's probably many more that you'd know, but this is I'm not promoting the past, but I really am an ardent supporter of civil rights for whether it be gays, whether it be dissidents. I think that dissent is absolutely essential to a healthy nation.
Yeah. No, that's crazy. I had no idea. I still can't get over this. I'm going to be telling my friends, you remember that show, Faces of Death? It turns out my friend Jaffer is the one who made it. And the marketing story, that is Bernays level awesome. That's I mean, they should do like a story about you in Mad Men if the show was still on like that, because that's that's an epic story.
I don't have the stomach for that anymore.
Yeah.
You know what? And that was the youth, and we would pat ourselves on the back. We were the company that took the Zapruder film, and we made the deal with the Zapruder estate to take the actual negative and digitize it and release it on DVD digitally. That was you could see it. We took a lot of flack because it was, when you digitized it and you could show it frame by frame, it was pretty vulgar in essence. It was pretty rough to watch.
Mm-hmm.
It was different than watching it on a newsreel. Because it's like that. We did a lot of things that were pushing the envelope, but I don't have that instinct anymore, or that impulse to do that.
Yeah, it's like Catch Me If You Can. The guy who he gives talks, and I've watched one recently, and he says very much the same thing. He goes, I did these things when I was a young man, which I would never do now, and I think they're very unethical. But there's something about I remember being that age. There's something about being that age where you just you've got the testosterone's pumping, and you have that killer instinct, and you're kind of crazy, right? As well. Yeah. You've said that Facebook advertising is completely useless, right? How are you? I've mentioned this. I've repeated this to many people, right? But why do you think this is the case?
Well, I mean, 92% of all ad dollars online, new ad dollars, are going to Facebook and Google. And Facebook, what they want you to use their analytics. And when we use an independent third-party analytics, Facebook was attributing 3 times more sales to its advertising than it was deserved. This is called misattribution. The sales were being attributed to Facebook advertising that should not have been.
Yeah.
And if you attribute the proper sales to Facebook, it doesn't work. I mean, by and large, okay? Yeah. I mean, most people don't really know how to attribute sales. It's a very difficult process. Now, we have been doing this for so many years, we can properly attribute sales to the right source. And so Facebook advertising is fraught with fraud. And by the way, and so is Google.
Yeah.
So it's somewhat problematic. I've written at length about this particular problem, but nobody really gives a shit. Pardon my French.
Oh, I really do. I really do. Because I think, after you told me that, the first time I was sort of incredulous. And then I thought about it. And I looked into a couple of things. Like, for instance, we started this group here in Montreal. You can check it out, like, after we're done with the interview. We started this group called the Montreal Convivium Series. And it was basically kind of like a book club, and somebody from the group, I still don't know who did it, actually. I suspect it was my friend David, but I don't know, paid Facebook some money to do some advertising. Right. Well, we suddenly noticed in the space of 2 or 3 days that something ridiculous, like I think like 1,500 people liked the page, like out of nowhere. Right. So it looks as if like this advertising went really, really well. But then when I looked into who actually liked the page, it was all these like college students and high school students in Indonesia. Yeah. And I have no idea how they even heard about it, but like they were liking this page. Them liking the page is not going to be of any use to us here in Montreal.
Right.
And so clearly somehow, I have no idea how the system was gamed, but they basically produced a bunch of likes somehow. Right. And I know like the former mayor of Montreal, there was a similar thing where they did like a study of his Twitter followers, and they found that 2/3 of his followers were fake accounts, right? And they brought this up, and he said, and I actually believe him, I don't think he was bullshitting. He said, I had no idea. I thought these were, he goes, yes, we paid this particular marketing companies that specializes in social media. We paid them to help increase our Twitter followers. Sure. And we got a big rise in Twitter followers. We assumed this was like real. Well, it turns out that they were almost like 2/3 of his Twitter followers were fake.
Yeah. If you buy likes, buy Twitter followers, buy clicks, the online media landscape is over 50% of all is fraud.
Wow.
Think about that. Over 50% is fraud. And that is why my company, Pulse TV, we created our own media to use ourselves. So, we're creating 150 million impressions a month that we know it's 100% real. Mm-hmm. There's no fraud whatsoever. Okay, but I mean, when we go out into the marketplace, we know we can measure fraud. It is a terrible thing that Twitter just got rid of 20% of all of the followers, of their users. 20%.
Yeah. That is just unbelievable. These were all just fake accounts and bots?
Fake
and
accounts, correct. Exactly right.
So is this why because I've noticed you have one of the most eclectic some might say weird, idiosyncratic collection of friends in social media land. And is that because you just filter for individuals, or how do? Because
well, you know what? I mean, you know what? There's some that I would. I think they may be fascist. I mean, literally. I mean, I got to.
Yeah,
tell
we know who I know who you're talking about. We're talking about the
Okay.
same person. Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, sometimes they will say something that's really interesting, and I do use. I mean, the it does create an interesting flow of information that I get, and it covers the political spectrum. And then I filter that out using my own kind of oddball worldview.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I remember when you were up here in Montreal last time, you told me something which has like really stuck with me. It was you were talking about how if I was one of the pieces of advice I would give a student or a young person is you should sort of harbor, even if you don't believe it, just as a good intellectual exercise, or moral exercise, you should harbor at least one really unpopular belief.
Yeah.
And
Right.
because that will like make you stronger, having to like
Yeah.
sort of deal with the people disapproving of your belief. And I mean, you definitely have some beliefs that that people find a little bit wacky. So,
Yeah, there's no question. There's no question
the
about it. But you know what? It's kind of a spice of life.
is that,
I mean, you know what? You want to fill your palate with the wide assortment of flavors.
yeah. Well, what interests me is that among people who sort of value character and virtue and have certain other interests, people who have a more sort of what I would call like a philosophical temperament and worldview, I find that those kind of people usually have a high degree of tolerance for differences of opinion and religious, political, and stuff like that. Like that, it doesn't matter to them quite as much. Whereas the people who are in the opposite end of the spectrum, who are not very philosophical, they really demand conformity. Like you have to sort of agree with them on 95% of things, and if you don't, then you're out, right?
The one thing that kind of baffles me is how tolerance and intolerance is being viewed. There are some that believe that intolerance is just the purview of the left, when I see plenty of intolerance on the right. I mean, if you're a fundamentalist, creationist, a lot of times you're not going to tolerate, somebody who's gay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. If you're a fundamentalist Muslim, sometimes you're not going to really appreciate somebody who believes in experiential road to paradise, if you will.
Yeah.
The Sufis have been victimized by fundamentalist Muslims, and they're very conservative, right wing, in that respect, in every religion. So I think,
and moderates can be very intolerant too.
Well, I guess intolerance goes across and up and down, but nobody can claim exclusivity on it.
Yeah. Well, I find what's interesting, and this is one of the things I've always seen in you, which I admire, is it seems to me that there's two different kinds of tolerance. There's a kind of tolerance that comes from sort of condescension. It's like sort of the tolerance that adults have for children that still believe in Santa Claus.
A patronizing tolerance.
Exactly. There's a patronizing tolerance where you are tolerating somebody because you basically think that they're less intelligent or less educated or less worldly than you are, and so you're like, oh, isn't that cute that you believe the tolerance of an anthropologist, basically, right? Who's in the middle of the Amazon, and oh, isn't that cute that you believe in that, right? And then there's another kind of tolerance, which is the kind I see in you, which is a tolerance that comes from epistemological humility, right? So it comes from a position of, look, I know that I have been so wrong in the past, and I remember being certain of something and then being proven wrong. So I know that I have been wrong in the past, And so it's possible that I'm wrong about some things in the present. And so therefore, I'm not going to be, it's a tolerance that comes from humility rather than sort of arrogance.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think you said it better than I did. I think, but it's spot on.
And when you hear people trying to be tolerant from the first standpoint, like if you have a New York Times reporter who's saying, "Oh, I want to understand Trump people," right, and so goes into some small town and is trying to sort of, they can see through that arrogance so quickly that they can see that you're just an anthropologist hanging out with the natives, and they hate you, right? I mean, they're annoyed, like because they can see, they can see what you're actually doing. I mean, but so do you think, on balance, do you think social media is making us less tolerant, more tolerant, or having no effect at all? It's basically the same thing.
No, I actually think it's making us less tolerant as it pushes us. Um, you know, I think less people have an eclectic group of friends. I think that they end up, it becomes an echo chamber, and it becomes more of a bubble, by and large. Um, so I think that opinions become more concrete.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, excuse me. Sorry. But I still prefer it to um, the other end of the spectrum being an authoritarian Pravda.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I wanted to sort of front this idea to you, see what you think of this, because it's something I'm just playing around. It's not fully formed. But if you go back during the Great Depression, you had like the WPA, right? And they had
Correct.
sort of these big make work projects. Well, one of the projects that they did, just sort of trying to find jobs for people, was they had these anthropologists and sort of social scientists. They had them go all over the United States and record speech patterns. And I've listened to a bunch of this. You can listen to it in the Jefferson Building, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And it is absolutely fascinating, because what you realize, and you have to imagine that 50 years before this, 100 years before this, it would have been exponentially more pronounced. But the United States had hundreds of different accents. There were regional accents that were so distinct, where you would have an accent that was from one town in Ohio or one town in Vermont, and then just a town over, they would have a slightly different accent. So there was this incredibly rich kind of diversity of ways of talking, and there were little pockets of different things. But then, because of mass media, because everybody started listening to the radio, that had the effect of sort of flattening out accents, right? So if you go like to present day, there are less regional accents in the United States than there were before, because of television and radio. And it seems like what is happening now with social media is going back to that same kind of fragmentary, diverse universe where people sort of live in little pockets and they get their information from certain people, right? So it almost seems like in some ways it's going back to what is much more the human norm, that it was the monoculture that was brought on by, like what you were saying, how if you could have that one commercial on, what was it, on Green Acres or on
Beverly Hills.
Beverly Hills. If you could have that, would be like 60 million people would see it, right? Like, well, that kind of monoculture is breaking down, and it's becoming very fragmentary. So maybe this is what they had before. Maybe this is not so bad.
Well, you know what? I hadn't thought of it like that. Of course, then we had the mass internal migrations, from Tennessee to the cities, going from, so it was not just mass media. It was literally people, were moving,
Yeah.
I mean, but I like your hypothesis. It's an interesting one. And it could be that we're returning to an era of pre-mass media.
Yeah. Well, that's what Taleb says. He says we're basically going back to the city state. We're going back to small towns that more manageable numbers of people, where you get your information from people that you trust rather than from, one big source, right? But anyway, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. And
thank you.
We definitely have to do this again. Is there any sort of parting comments or parting words you'd like to say to our listeners?
You know what? It's been an honor to be on this podcast and to reconnect with a dear friend of mine, you. Well, and I can't wait to come back to Montreal.
Yeah, you have to. You have to. All right. Well, I hope you have a wonderful day. And by the way, I forgot to thank you. Thank you so much for helping my son Tristan with his school project. That was very kind of you. Taking all that time to talk to him about his project on Islam. That was very helpful. Yeah.
All right.
All right. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, you, John. Thanks.
Take care. Bye.